James was sitting in his messy apartment, mindlessly looking at his phone, when an email grabbed his attention. It was from someone he hadn't talked to in years, Emily, a friend from when they were kids. They grew up in a small town together but lost touch after high school. The email was brief and clear. "James, I know it's been a while, but I really need your help. I got an old house from my great uncle. It's breaking down, and I can't deal with it by myself. I remember how much you enjoyed looking around old buildings. Can you come over this weekend? I'll tell you everything when you arrive." The invitation made him feel a mix of old memories and interest. He had happy memories of exploring empty places when he was a kid, but those adventures were much simpler than the adult world. After thinking for a short time, he chose to go. What's wrong with going on a weekend trip? That Friday, he packed a bag and drove 3 hours away from the city to the small town where Emily now lived. The town was different from when he last came. The main street was almost empty, and many of the stores were closed and covered up. It seemed like a place where time had stopped. When he got to Emily's new house, he noticed it was special and not like other houses. It was the old house, a big, run-down mansion on the edge of town that many local stories talked about. The kids challenged each other to go inside, but no one ever went in. It was said to have been left empty for more than 50 years because of a series of strange deaths in the family that lived there. James shivered as he got to the house. The big house stood out in the countryside, looking like a dark shadow. The wooden boards on the windows shook in the wind, and the front gate was loose and squeaked as it moved. It was the perfect spot for a scary movie. Emily stood on the porch, waving nervously as he came closer. Her face was pale, and her eyes looked empty, like she hadn't slept in a long time. "Thank you for being here," she said softly. "I really need your help with this." When they walked in, James saw that the house was in worse shape than he thought. The wallpaper was coming off, the floorboards squeaked loudly with every step, and there was a damp smell in the air. What bothered him the most was how he felt when he walked into the house. It felt heavy and uncomfortable, like the house was watching him. "So, what's going on?" he asked, trying to sound relaxed. Emily looked around anxiously before answering. "I've been here for about a week, trying to clean up and find anything that can be saved. But strange things have been happening. Sounds during the night. Doors that won't stay shut. I've seen shadows moving from the side of my eye. I know it sounds strange, but I think there's something important here." James smiled smugly. "It's an old house, Emily. Of course, there will be sounds. It's likely just getting used to it." But inside, he felt that something wasn't right. That night, after they had spent the day cleaning up and fixing some of the visible damage, they decided to go to bed. Emily had put up a few air mattresses in one of the only rooms that wasn't in bad shape, the library. The walls were filled with old, dusty books, and a big fireplace took up one side of the room. As they got comfortable, James felt a bit worried. The wind was loud outside, causing the windows to shake. The light from the fireplace was shaky and made strange shadows move around the room. He lay down and tried to sleep, but every noise in the house made him feel scared. At some point, he must have fallen asleep because a loud crash suddenly woke him up. He sat up, his heart racing. The room was dark, except for the weak light from the fading fire. Emily was still sleeping next to him, but something felt different. The air felt colder and thicker, like the house was waiting quietly. Then he heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible. It sounded like people were talking, but he couldn't understand what they were saying. He tried hard to hear and looked around the room, but no one was there. "Emily," he said softly, nudging her to wake her up. She sighed and sat up, rubbing her eyes. "What is it? Do you hear that?" he asked. They both sat quietly for a moment, paying attention. The soft talking had ended. "I can't hear anything," she said, her voice trembling. "Go back to sleep." But James couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. The next morning, while having breakfast, James chose to ask Emily about the house's history. As a child, he heard stories that were mostly just rumors, fuzzy tales about curses and ghosts. "Do you know anything about the people who used to live here?" he asked while drinking his coffee. Emily nodded slowly, looking down. "I didn't think about it much at first, but after I got the place, I looked into it. It turns out my great-uncle wasn't the last person to live here. The house belonged to a family named the Hawthorns, and people didn't really like them. People were talking about them in a bad way. People said they did odd ceremonies and were involved in magical or mysterious things." James lifted one eyebrow. "Are you really just telling me this now?" "I didn't think it mattered," she said, getting defensive. "I guess those are just stories, but the longer I'm here, the more I feel that something isn't right." James couldn't ignore that the house felt unusual. The more time he spent there, the more he felt like someone was watching him. Then, there were the weird things happening, soft voices, chilly areas, and a feeling of discomfort that seemed to hang in the air. That afternoon, they chose to look around the house more, hoping to learn about its scary past. They went into the basement, a place Emily had been too scared to go before. The basement was much worse than the rest of the house. The walls were covered in weird symbols that looked like they were made with dried blood. In the middle of the room was a big stone table that was dusty and had spider webs on it. James felt a shiver go down his back as he looked at it. "This is all wrong," he said quietly. Emily nodded, looking very pale. "I think we should go." As they began to leave, they heard a sound, a gentle shuffling noise, like someone walking on the stone floor. James stopped suddenly, and his heart was beating fast. The noise got louder and closer until it felt like it was right behind them.
They looked around, but there was nothing there. The basement was bare. But James could sense it, the presence, the thing that had been watching them since they got there. It was real, and it was mad. That night, the house seemed to wake up. James and Emily tried to go to sleep, but the noise got louder again. The whispers came back, stronger and meaner. Shadows flickered in the corners of the room, moving too quickly to seem real. Doors closed loudly by themselves, and it got very cold, making them shake under their blankets. Around midnight, the sound of footsteps filled the halls, heavy and slow, as if someone was walking back and forth right outside their door. Emily grabbed James's arm, looking very scared. "We have to go," she said quietly. James nodded, but just as they got up, the library door flew open, and a cold wind rushed into the room. The fire in the fireplace went out, leaving them in the dark. In the dim light of their flashlights, they saw a dark shape of a person in the doorway. It was very tall and skinny, with bright red eyes that looked like they could see deep into their hearts. James's heart beat fast as he took Emily's hand and pulled her to the door. They ran through the dark hallways, and they could hear footsteps behind them getting louder and faster. They got to the front door and pushed it open, but were met with complete darkness. The world outside the house was gone, replaced by a dark emptiness. "We're stuck," Emily said, her voice trembling. James was uncertain about what to do. Every part of him wanted to run, but he had no place to escape. The house had them, and it wasn't going to let them go.
In a final attempt, they rushed back to the basement, hoping to find something that could help them. The unusual signs on the walls looked like they were softly shining in the dark, and the air felt heavy with a strong energy. When they got to the altar, Emily took a deep breath in surprise. "See," James turned and saw what she was pointing to, a worn-out book, resting on the altar. It wasn't there,